The grand hall of the Gyari Dominion's worship was cold, vast, and intimidating. Blue crystalline pillars stretched high toward the ceiling, reflecting the eerie glow of the energy lanterns. At the center of the room stood Princess Valeri, heir to the Gyari throne, her posture stiff, her sharp violet eyes scanning the entrance with unreadable calm. She had been trained all her life to command respect, to control her emotions, to remain superior in the presence of lesser beings. But today, for the first time, she felt something unexpected: uncertainty. The enemy was late. She exhaled slowly, keeping her hands clasped behind her back. Around her, Gyari guards in shimmering battle armor stood in rigid formation, silent, watching, ready. Then, the door slid open with a deep metallic hiss. A human stepped inside. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark military uniform with an insignia on his chest. His confident steps echoed through the hall, his expression calm but alert. His piercing brown eyes locked onto hers without hesitation. He did not bow. A flicker of irritation crossed Valeri's mind, but she quickly buried it. She had expected an ambassador, a diplomat, perhaps even an admiral. But instead, the Terran Republic had sent a soldier. She studied him carefully. His presence was unsettling, not because he was human, but because he was unshaken. Most who stood before her hesitated, stumbled over their words, or at least showed some form of intimidation. But this man, he simply stared back, as if he was judging her just as much as she was judging him. Finally, the human spoke. Commander Darius Kane, representing the Terran Republic. His voice was steady, strong. No fear, no arrogance. Just simple, direct words. Valeri narrowed her eyes slightly. Your leader sent a warrior instead of a diplomat. Darius shrugged slightly. Your people respect strength. I assume that's why you're standing here instead of your father. Her fingers twitched slightly, but she did not let her expression change. A direct challenge, masked as a simple statement. Bold. She stepped forward, her gaze locked onto his. I expected someone with more authority. Darius smirked. Funny. I was thinking the same thing. For the first time in a long while, Valeri felt something strange. Not anger, not frustration. Something else. She clenched her jaw. This negotiation is not a game, Commander. No, it's not, Darius said, his voice steady. So let's stop pretending. You and I both know that peace doesn't come from words alone. It comes from action. And right now, our people are watching. If we fail, they die. Silence. The weight of his words settled between them. He wasn't wrong. This war had already claimed thousands of lives. And despite her training, despite her duty, something inside her shifted at the way this human spoke, with conviction, with purpose. She inhaled deeply. This meeting was going to be much harder than she had expected. Princess Valeri kept her expression calm, but inside, she felt something unusual, a challenge. This human, Commander Darius Kane, was not like the others she had encountered. Most humans either feared her or tried to impress her. But this one, he stood firm, unshaken. The room was silent, the tension thick as they faced each other. The Gyari guards remained still, their glowing eyes locked on the human, waiting for any sign of disrespect. If he so much as twitched the wrong way, they would not hesitate to cut him down. Valeri took a slow step forward, keeping her gaze locked on him. If your leaders wanted peace, they should have sent someone with diplomacy, not war. Darius tilted his head slightly. And yet you're here instead of your father. Why is that, Princess? Afraid your people will see you as weak. A flicker of annoyance ran through her. Few dared to speak to her this way, even among her own kind. But she would not let him provoke her. I am here because I must be, she replied smoothly. Because this war has gone on long enough. Darius nodded. Then we agree on something. Valeri studied him, searching for deception, but she saw none. He was not trying to manipulate her. He was simply speaking his mind. She walked toward the negotiation table, her long robes flowing behind her. With a graceful motion, she took her seat. Then let us begin. Darius sat across from her. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes remained sharp. Tell me, Princess, what does the great Gyari Dominion truly want from this truce? She raised an eyebrow. You act as if you do not already know. I prefer to hear it directly, he replied. For a brief moment, she hesitated. How much could she say? Could she trust him? No, not yet. But she had to be careful. The Dominion does not seek endless war, she said. We seek order, control. Without it, there is only chaos. Darius exhaled, leaning back slightly. And yet your people invaded Terran space first. That doesn't look like order to us. That looks like conquest. Valeri's fingers tightened slightly against the table. Your kind does not understand balance. You expand without thought, without consideration. If we had not intervened, you would have spread like a disease. Darius chuckled softly. And yet, you're the ones asking for peace now. Silence. She knew he had a point. The Dominion had started this war, and now they were the ones forced to negotiate. I am here to end this conflict, she said at last, not to argue history. Darius nodded. Good. Then let's stop wasting time. For the first time, Valeri felt something unexpected. Respect. This human was not weak. He was not afraid. And that made him dangerous. The negotiation room was silent, but the tension between Princess Valeri and Commander Darius Kane felt like a storm waiting to break. Both of them sat across from each other, neither willing to show weakness. The guards around the chamber remained motionless, their sharp eyes locked onto the human. Even a single wrong movement, a misplaced word, and they would strike him down without hesitation. Darius remained calm, his fingers resting lightly on the table. You say you want peace, Princess, but your people still hold Terran colonies under your control. That's not peace. That's occupation. Valeri's violet eyes narrowed slightly. Your kind does not surrender easily. We needed leverage. Darius smirked, but there was no humor in it. Leverage, or an excuse to keep holding power. Before Valeri could respond, a sudden alarm blared through the hall. The guards instantly tensed, gripping their weapons as the metallic door slid open. A Gyari officer rushed in, his blue skin pale with urgency. Princess, we are under attack. Valeri immediately stood, her instincts sharp. Who dares? A loud explosion shook the room, sending dust and debris from the ceiling. The lights flickered, and for the first time, panic spread across the guards' faces. Darius was already on his feet. What's going on? The officer's voice was tense. Rebels. They seek to kill the princess and frame the Terrans for it. Valeri's eyes widened. This was not an accident. Someone within her own people wanted this truce to fail. The doors burst open, and heavily armed Gyari warriors stormed inside, their weapons raised. But they were not her guards. They were here to kill her. Chaos unfolds. The first shot fired, and Darius moved before he could think. He grabbed Valeri's arm and pulled her down just as an energy blast sizzled through the air where she had been standing. She gasped, but instinct took over as she drew her own blade from her hip. The traitors rushed forward, but Darius was faster. He lunged, grabbing one of the fallen guard's weapons and firing back. A streak of blue energy hit the nearest attacker, sending them sprawling. Valeri was stunned. This human was protecting her. She slashed at one of the assassins, her blade cutting through his armor. But there were too many. She was wounded, her strength failing. Darius noticed immediately. Princess, we need to move, he shouted, covering her as more rebels swarmed in. He grabbed her wrist, his grip firm but not cruel. For the first time in her life, Valeri was forced to rely on a human, and she had no choice but to trust him. Princess Valeri had trained for war, But nothing had prepared her for this, being betrayed by her own people and forced to rely on a human soldier for survival. Blaster fire echoed through the grand hall as rebels stormed in, their weapons glowing with deadly energy. The polished crystal walls of the chamber were now scorched with burn marks. The air smelled of smoke and betrayal. Darius did not hesitate. He fired back with precise shots, hitting two of the attackers before they could react. His movements were sharp, calculated, like a warrior who had been through worse. Valari clenched her jaw, trying to suppress the pain from the wound on her side. She had taken a graze from a blaster shot, and though it was not fatal, the sting burned through her nerves. "We need to move," Darius barked, grabbing her wrist again. Valari stiffened. No one touched her without permission. No one. But this was not the time to argue. More rebels poured in, their weapons raised. The main exit was blocked. Darius scanned the room quickly, then pointed to the side corridor. There. Valari gritted her teeth. She should not be taking orders from a human, but she could see no other way. They ran. Through the shadows. The corridor was dimly lit, the crystal walls vibrating from the distant explosions. The ship was under siege, and whoever was behind this had planned it well. Darius led the way, his steps quick but controlled. Valari followed, forcing herself to keep pace despite the pain. "You're bleeding," Darius said, glancing at her side. "I am aware," she snapped. He didn't reply, but she noticed the way his eyes flickered with something unreadable. Concern. No, humans did not care for her kind. Did they? They reached an intersection. Darius peeked around the corner, then immediately pulled back. More of them, heavily armed. Valari exhaled sharply. They were trapped. Her mind raced. If they could reach the docking bay, they could escape. But first, they had to get past the rebels. She looked at Darius. "Can you fight hand to hand?" His lips curled into a smirk. "Princess, I grew up in the trenches. I don't need a blaster to take them down." Valari had no time to question his confidence. This had to work. The battle in the hallway. She stepped into the corridor first. The rebels turned, surprised. "There she is." Before they could finish, Darius struck. He lunged forward, knocking one rebel's weapon away and landing a solid punch to his jaw. The alien stumbled back, dazed. Valari moved like a shadow, her blade slicing through the second attacker's leg. He fell with a scream. Within seconds, the fight was over. They had won. Darius exhaled. "Not bad, Princess." She straightened, wiping the blood from her blade. "I could say the same for you, human." Their eyes met. For the first time, Valari realized something terrifying. This human was not her enemy anymore. He was her only hope. The cold corridors of the ship seemed endless, stretching into the darkness like a maze. Valari's breathing was steady, though her wounds still burned with every step. Beside her, Darius Kane moved silently, his weapon held tight, and his sharp eyes scanning every shadow. They were no longer simply running from rebels. They were hunting for answers. The ambush had been too coordinated, too precise. Valari had long suspected dissension within her own ranks, but this attack confirmed it. Someone in the Gyari court wanted her dead. Yet here she was, working side by side with a human soldier, a sworn enemy. If she had told herself a day ago that this would happen, she would have laughed. But now, laughter seemed a distant memory. Piecing the puzzle. "Princess," Darius said quietly, his voice low and calm. "When we took cover back there, I heard them say something. They mentioned a name, General Tyros." Valari's steps slowed. That name was familiar, too familiar. "Tyros," she repeated, her tone icy. "My uncle." Darius raised an eyebrow. "Family betrayal. That's not what I expected." She shot him a sharp look. "The Gyari are not immune to politics, human. Power corrupts all species." Darius nodded, his expression neutral. So he wants your throne, and he would burn everything in his path to get it. There was a long silence as they continued down the corridor. Vale Airy's mind was racing. Her uncle had always been ambitious, always questioning the balance of power. But to conspire with rebels, to endanger the entire Dominion just for a chance at the crown, it was unthinkable. Still, the evidence was clear. The rebels had shouted Cyro's name, and the timing of the attack could not be ignored. The reluctant alliance. "So what's the plan?" Darius asked. His tone was calm, practical, as if they weren't deep in enemy territory. Valerie hesitated. This was the moment where she would usually call for reinforcements, rely on her loyal guards. But those options were gone. She was alone, save for the human decider. "We need proof," she said at last. "Something we can use to expose Cyros. Without it, I am just a wounded princess accusing a decorated general of treason." "And where exactly do we find this proof?" Valerie stopped and turned to face him. Her violet eyes met his. "You are the soldier. You have survived in impossible situations. Find us a way out of this labyrinth. Get me to the command room." Darius smirked faintly. "And here I thought you didn't like taking orders from a human." She allowed herself a thin smile. "Desperation breeds necessity. Do not let it go to your head." Moving forward, as they pressed on, Valerie began to realize something. While she still viewed Darius as a Terran outsider, his calm presence and resourcefulness were invaluable. The situation was grim, but for the first time since the attack, she felt a faint glimmer of hope. The enemy of her enemy was no longer just a human. He was her ally. The halls of the Gyari ship were eerily quiet now. The echoes of blaster fire and the clash of swords had faded, leaving only the sound of footsteps, hers and the humans. Princess Valerie kept her gaze forward, her hand resting lightly on the hilt of her blade. Beside her, Commander Darius Kane moved with a steady confidence, his weapon at the ready. They had made progress, carving their way through the chaos, but the destination was still uncertain. In the silence, she began to notice things about him. The way his breathing remained controlled despite the danger. The way his eyes scanned every shadow, calculating risks before she even noticed them. He was a soldier in every sense, but not the brutish kind she had always imagined Terrans to be. It was unsettling. A moment of rest. They found a small storage chamber tucked behind a blast door. It offered a brief reprieve from the endless corridors and potential ambushes. Valerie leaned against the wall, her strength waning. The wound on her side still ached, and though she hadn't said it aloud, she was growing weaker with each passing moment. Darius set down his weapon and crouched next to her. "Let me take a look." She stiffened. "I am fine." "You're not," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Let me see." Reluctantly, she shifted her robe aside, revealing the burned flesh where the blaster shot had grazed her. Darius winced. "That looks bad." "It is nothing I cannot handle," she replied, but her voice lacked conviction. He reached into his pack, pulling out a small medical kit. "Hold still." Valerie watched him work, his hand steady as he applied a healing salve. She expected his touch to be rough, but it was surprisingly gentle. She hated that it didn't feel entirely unpleasant. "You've done this before," she said quietly. "Too many times," he replied without looking up. "A soldier's story." For the first time, Valerie felt the urge to ask, "How many battles have you fought?" Darius hesitated. "More than I care to count." "And yet you still fight," she said, her voice edged with curiosity. "Why?" He paused, meeting her gaze. "Because someone has to, and because if I don't, the people I care about won't make it home." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that caught her off guard. It was human, yet it resonated with her. She turned her head away, unwilling to let him see the small crack in her icy demeanor. "You are strange, human. I cannot decide if your kind is foolish or admirable. Maybe we're both," he said with a faint smirk. Moving on, Darius helped her back to her feet, and they stepped out of the chamber. The journey was far from over, but something had shifted. For the first time, Val-Eri found herself wondering if this Terran soldier was more than just a tool for survival. Perhaps, against all odds, he was someone she could trust. Princess Val-Eri and Commander Darius Kane continued deeper into the maze of corridors, each step bringing them closer to the command room. The air grew colder, the lights dimmer, as if the ship itself reflected the growing tension between them. For hours, they had relied on each other, fighting, strategizing, surviving. Val-Eri had long accepted that Darius was no ordinary Terran soldier. He was resourceful, brave, and maddeningly calm under pressure. But this alliance was temporary. Once they reached the command room, their paths would part. At least that was what she told herself. The command room within reach. Darius stopped suddenly, raising a hand for silence. Val-Eri froze, her hand instinctively gripping the hilt of her blade. They listened. Distant voices echoed ahead. Not rebels. Jayari soldiers. She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. Loyalists. Possibly, Darius replied, keeping his tone low. But if they're working for Xyros, we're walking into another trap. Val-Eri considered this. Thyro's betrayal ran deep. She had no guarantee anyone left on this ship could be trusted. We don't have time to hesitate, she said, straightening. If we linger here, they'll find us. Darius gave a small nod, but his gaze lingered on her. You sure you're ready for this? She met his eyes, ignoring the faint pull of exhaustion in her limbs. I have no choice. My people are at stake. A costly decision. They moved forward together, slipping through the shadows. The voices grew louder, and soon they reached a chamber with a partially open door. Inside, several Jayari officers stood around a holo display. Val-Eri's heart clenched. She recognized one of them. Commander Renar, a trusted aide to her uncle. If he was here, it meant one thing. They were outnumbered and outmatched. She stepped back, her mind racing. Could she reason with them? Convince them to stand down? Darius pulled her aside, his voice a rough whisper. You're not seriously thinking of walking in there and announcing yourself, are you? I am their princess, she hissed. If I can sway them. You'll be dead before you finish your sentence, he interrupted. We need proof. Evidence of Cyro's plans. Barging in now will only get you killed. Val-Eri's fists clenched. He was right. She hated that he was right. So what do you suggest, human? He smirked faintly, his confidence unshaken. A distraction. I'll draw them out. You slip inside and download whatever files you need. She stared at him, shocked. That's suicide. I'm not planning to get caught, he replied, a hint of humor in his voice. Val-Eri hesitated. It was a terrible plan, but it was the only plan. Moving forward, with a reluctant nod, she agreed. Fine, but if you die, don't expect me to mourn you. Darius grinned. Understood, princess. As he stepped forward to execute the plan, Val-Eri couldn't ignore the strange weight in her chest. He was risking his life. For her, and she didn't know how to feel about that. Princess Val-Eri and Commander Darius Kane continued deeper into the maze of corridors, each step bringing them closer to the command room. The air grew colder, the lights dimmer, as if the ship itself reflected the growing tension between them. For hours, they had relied on each other, fighting, strategizing, surviving. Val-Eri had long accepted that Darius was no ordinary Terran soldier. He was resourceful, brave, and maddeningly calm under pressure. But this alliance was temporary. Once they reached the command room, their paths would part. At least, that was what she told herself. The command room within reach. Darius stopped suddenly, raising a hand for silence. Val-Eri froze, her hand instinctively gripping the hilt of her blade. They listened. Distant voices echoed ahead. Not rebels. Jayari soldiers. She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. Loyalists. Possibly, Darius replied, keeping his tone low. But if they're working for Xyros, we're walking into another trap. Valerie considered this. Tyro's betrayal ran deep. She had no guarantee anyone left on this ship could be trusted. We don't have time to hesitate, she said, straightening. If we linger here, they'll find us. Darius gave a small nod, but his gaze lingered on her. You sure you're ready for this? She met his eyes, ignoring the faint pull of exhaustion in her limbs. I have no choice. My people are at stake. A costly decision. They moved forward together, slipping through the shadows. The voices grew louder, and soon they reached a chamber with a partially open door. Inside, several Gyari officers stood around a holo display. Valharie's heart clenched. She recognized one of them. Commander Reinar, a trusted aide to her uncle. If he was here, it meant one thing. They were outnumbered and outmatched. She stepped back, her mind racing. Could she reason with them, convince them to stand down? Darius pulled her aside, his voice a rough whisper. You're not seriously thinking of walking in there and announcing yourself, are you? I am their princess, she hissed. If I can sway them. You'll be dead before you finish your sentence, he interrupted. We need proof. Evidence of Tyro's plans. Barging in now will only get you killed. Valerie's fists clenched. He was right. She hated that he was right. So what do you suggest, human? He smirked faintly, his confidence unshaken. A distraction. I'll draw them out. You slip inside and download whatever files you need. She stared at him, shocked. That's suicide. I'm not planning to get caught, he replied, a hint of humor in his voice. Valerie hesitated. It was a terrible plan, but it was the only plan. Moving forward. With a reluctant nod, she agreed. Fine. But if you die, don't expect me to mourn you. Darius grinned. Understood, princess. As he stepped forward to execute the plan, Valerie couldn't ignore the strange weight in her chest. He was risking his life. For her. And she didn't know how to feel about that. The instant Valerie stepped into view, the room changed. The Gyari soldiers froze, their confusion giving way to alarm as they realized who stood before them. It's the princess, one of them shouted, raising his weapon. Before they could react, Valerie moved. With a swift, graceful strike, she knocked the blaster from one soldier's hand, her glowing blade a blur in the dim chamber. Stand down, she ordered, her voice sharp and commanding. By the authority of the crown, I command you to lower your weapons. Some of the soldiers hesitated, their loyalty to the royal family clashing with their orders from Xyros. Darius used the moment to break free from the grip of the guard holding him. A quick elbow strike sent the Gyari soldier staggering, and Darius grabbed his fallen weapon. He nodded toward Valerie. Nice timing, princess. She didn't respond. Her focus was entirely on the soldiers still pointing their weapons at her. You swore loyalty to the Dominion, she continued, to the throne. If you raise your weapons against me, you betray everything we stand for. A fractured allegiance. One of the younger soldiers lowered his rifle, doubt etched on his face. Princess, we were told you were working with the humans, that you had betrayed us. Lies fed to you by Xyros, Valerie replied, her tone firm. He is the one who betrayed the Dominion. He ordered this attack. He wants to seize power for himself, no matter how many lives it costs. More soldiers wavered. Reinar, however, did not. His eyes narrowed. Do not listen to her. She's desperate, trying to save her own skin. The general's orders are clear. Take her out. He stepped forward, raising his weapon. Valerie's blade was up in an instant, blocking the shot. The clash of energy filled the room. Darius joins the fight. Darius didn't waste a second. While Valerie engaged Reinar, he fired at the remaining rebels who still held their ground. His shots were precise, hitting their weapons or forcing them into cover. The room became a chaotic battlefield. Ari and Rainar's blades clashed, their strikes sending sparks across the chamber. The princess moved with precision, her training evident in every step, but Reinar was relentless. Darius backed her up, covering her flank as more soldiers hesitated, unsure of whom to follow. A shift in the tide. The loyal soldiers, those who still believed in the royal family, finally found their courage. They turned on Reinar's men, creating a moment of chaos that Ari used to gain the upper hand. Her blade struck true, disarming Reinar and sending him to the ground. She stood over him, her eyes blazing. Your betrayal ends here. The room fell into silence. The glow of Valeri's blade reflected off the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch forever. Commander Reinar, the traitor, lay at her feet, defeated and disarmed. The remaining loyalists lowered their weapons, exchanging uncertain glances. Valeri's voice rang out, strong and unwavering. Let this be a reminder to all who would conspire against the Dominion. Treason has no place here. She turned to Darius, who was catching his breath after the battle. His uniform was torn, and a fresh scorch mark marred his sleeve, but he still stood tall. He had fought fiercely, protecting her flank when the fighting was at its most desperate. Ari nodded to him, the faintest hint of respect in her gaze. You saved more than my life today, Terran. Darius gave her a tired grin. That's one way to break a diplomatic impasse. The proof delivered. Now that the traitor's forces had been defeated, Ari retrieved the evidence she had gathered from the command console. She played the recording for everyone in the room. Xyros's orders, his demands to the rebel faction, his promise of power in exchange for the princess's death. The loyal soldiers stiffened at the betrayal laid bare. Whatever doubt they had about Valeri's leadership disappeared in that moment. One by one, they knelt. Princess, one of them said solemnly, our loyalty is to you and the throne. Valeri sheathed her blade and looked down at Reinar, who glared back in defiance. Take him into custody. We will deal with him and the other traitors under the law. An unlikely alliance. As the soldiers moved to secure the prisoners, Ari turned to Darius. You have proven yourself human. You are no longer just an enemy soldier to me. Darius raised an eyebrow. Does this mean we're friends now? She gave a faint smile, the first real one he'd seen. Do not push your luck, Commander Kane. His chuckle was low but genuine. Fair enough. Ari paused, as if weighing her words carefully. Your actions saved the Dominion today. My people are not quick to trust outsiders, but I will ensure the court knows what you did here. And your uncle? Darius asked, his voice steady. What happens to him? He will answer for his crimes, she said firmly, and his name will be erased from the royal lineage. Treachery has no place in the Gyari Dominion. Moving forward, Darius inclined his head. Then it sounds like my job here is done. You are free to return to your people, Ari replied, though a strange heaviness tugged at her voice. But know that you have earned the respect of the Dominion. Not many Terrans can claim that. Darius extended a hand. Ari hesitated briefly, then clasped it. The handshake was brief, but it spoke of something more, mutual respect, born out of necessity and forged in battle. As they parted ways, both knew their paths might never cross again. But for that brief, fleeting moment, they had changed each other's worlds.